The rifle cracked once, and a streak of fire arced across the jungle darkness like a comet falling sideways. It hit the log bunker 30 meters away and exploded into flames that clung to wood and flesh and sandbags with a hunger of something alive. The Japanese soldiers inside screamed. Some ran. Most burned. The Marines who fired the shot didn't move from cover. They didn't charge. They didn't expose themselves to return fire. They just loaded another round and fired again. By the time the third projectile hit, the bunker was an inferno and the defensive line was collapsing. One Japanese soldier, pulled from the flames by his comrades, would later tell an interrogator that the Americans had rifles that breathed fire, that they could kill from a distance without bullets, that fighting them was like fighting dragons. He was not being poetic. He was trying to describe something he had never seen before and did not understand. The weapon was an M1 Garand rifle modified to launch incendiary projectiles filled with napalm-based fuel. The Marines called it a dragon rifle. The Japanese called it a nightmare. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. This is a story of a weapon that was never supposed to exist, born from desperation, on an island most people have never heard of, designed by men who had no training in weapons engineering, but plenty of experience in dying. It's about the innovation that happens when doctrine fails, when standard tactics can't break through, when soldiers are told to take a position that seems impossible to take, and they find a way to do it anyway. And it starts not with fire, but with mud and blood and the realization that sometimes the only way forward is to burn everything in your path. September 1944. Peleliu Island, Palau. The battle was supposed to last 4 days. It would last 2 months. The island was a nightmare of coral ridges, limestone caves, and fortified positions that turned every advance into a killing ground. The Japanese had spent months preparing the defenses, digging tunnels and bunkers so deep that naval bombardment barely scratched them. The Marines landed expecting resistance. They found a fortress. Every ridge was defended. Every cave was a strong point. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Flamethrowers could clear bunkers if you could get close enough, but getting close meant crossing open ground under fire, and most men who tried it died before they reached their target. Grenades worked if you could get them into the firing slits, but the slits were narrow and the throw had to be perfect. Artillery helped, but the Japanese were dug in so deep that even direct hits often failed to neutralize the positions. The Marines were stuck. Men were dying by the dozen for gains measured in meters. Something had to change. Corporal Daniel Reeves, 1st Marine Division, had been on Peleliu for 11 days when he had the idea that would become the Dragon Rifle. Reeves was a rifleman from Montana, 23 years old, a hunter before the war who understood guns the way some men understand engines or horses. He had carried an M1 Garand since boot camp, and he loved the weapon for its reliability and power. But on Peleliu, rifles felt useless. The enemy was behind rock and concrete. Bullets ricocheted off limestone. You could fire 100 rounds at a bunker and accomplish nothing except telling the enemy where you were. Reeves had watched 3 men from his platoon get cut down trying to get close enough to use a flamethrower. He had watched the demolition team get wiped out trying to place charges. He had seen good Marines die because the weapons they had couldn't reach the positions they needed to destroy. He spent the night of September 22nd in a shell crater, staring at his rifle and thinking about flamethrowers. The flamethrower was the only weapon that worked against the bunkers. Fire got into the firing slits. It filled the interior spaces. It killed with heat and smoke and fear. But the range was terrible, maybe 30 meters on a good day, and the operator was a target the moment he stood up. Reeves wondered if there was a way to get the fire to the target without getting the man close to the target. He thought about rifle grenades, which use a blank cartridge to launch an explosive projectile. He thought about the fuel tanks the flamethrowers used, pressurized containers filled with a mixture of gasoline and a thickening agent that made the fuel stick and burn longer. He thought about what would happen if you could put that fuel into a projectile and launch it with a rifle. The range would be 5 times what a flamethrower could manage. The operator could stay in cover, and the fire would still do what fire did best. The idea was insane. It violated every regulation about modifying weapons. It required materials and tools the Marines didn't have. It might not work. It might blow up in his face. But Reeves could not stop thinking about it. The next morning, he found a dead flamethrower operator and stripped the fuel tank from the body. He found a rifle grenade launcher attachment in a supply crate. He found a length of aluminum tubing in the wreckage of a Japanese vehicle. And he went to work. He spent 2 days experimenting, trying to figure out how to make a projectile that would hold fuel, survive the launch, and ignite on impact. The first version exploded during testing and nearly killed him. The second version launched but didn't ignite. The third version worked. He filled a small cylindrical container with fuel, attached a simple impact fuse made from a shotgun primer and a striker pin, and mounted the whole assembly onto a grenade launcher. He loaded a blank cartridge into his rifle, aimed at a burned-out Japanese truck 20 meters away, and fired. The projectile hit the truck and erupted into flames. Reeves stood there for a full minute, watching the fire, before he realized what it had just created. He showed it to his squad leader, Sergeant William Kovac. Kovac was a veteran of Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, a man who had seen enough combat to know that survival mattered more than regulations. He listened to Reeves explain the weapon, watched him demonstrate it, and then told him to make more. Kovac didn't ask for permission. He didn't file a report. He just told Reeves to build as many as he could and to teach the other men how to use them. Within a week, 6 men in the platoon had dragon rifles. Within 2 weeks, the weapon had spread to other platoons. It was never officially adopted. It was never tested by ordnance specialists. It was never approved by command. It simply appeared in the hands of Marines who needed it, passed along through the informal networks that connect soldiers in combat, built in foxholes and supplied tents by men who had learned that innovation was the price of survival. The first combat use of the Dragon rifle came on October 3rd, during an assault on a ridge the Marines called Bloody Nose. The ridge was a coral escarpment honeycombed with caves and bunkers, defended by entrenched Japanese infantry who had survived weeks of bombardment and assault. The attack was planned for dawn. The objective was a cluster of 3 bunkers that controlled the approach to the ridge. Standard tactics called for a flamethrower team to clear the bunkers, while riflemen provided covering fire. But the flamethrower operator had been killed the day before, and no replacement was available. Kovac looked at Reeves and told him it was time to see if the Dragon rifle was more than a clever idea. Reeves moved into position before first light. He carried his M1 Garand with a grenade launcher attachment and 6 incendiary projectiles packed in a canvas bag. 2 other Marines with Dragon rifles moved up beside him. The plan was simple. When the assault began, they would fire on the bunkers from a distance, try to ignite them or at least suppress the defenders long enough for the infantry to close the gap. If it worked, they might take the position with minimal casualties. If it didn't work, men would die and Reeves would spend the rest of his life knowing he had wasted time on a weapon that failed when it mattered most. The attack began at 0600. Artillery pounded the ridge for 5 minutes, then lifted. The Marines moved forward in a skirmish line, weapons ready, eyes scanning for movement. The Japanese held their fire, waiting for the Americans to get close. Reeves crouched behind a coral outcrop 50 meters from the nearest bunker. He loaded an incendiary round, aimed at the firing slit, and fired. The projectile arced through the morning air and hit the bunker just above the opening. It exploded into flames that poured down over the entrance and into the interior. Screams erupted from inside. Smoke billowed out. Reeves loaded another round and fired at the second bunker. This one hit the sandbag wall and sent burning fuel cascading across the position. The third Marine fired at the last bunker, and the projectile punched through the firing slit and detonated inside. The effect was immediate and devastating. All 3 bunkers were burning. The Japanese soldiers inside were dead, dying, or fleeing. The Marines advanced without taking a single casualty. The ridge that was supposed to take all day to capture fell in less than an hour. Word of the weapon spread fast. By mid-October, every company in the 1st Marine Division had at least a few Dragon rifles. Reeves and other soldiers refined the design, improving projectiles to make them more reliable, increasing the fuel load to extend the burn time, experimenting with different fuses to ensure ignition. The weapon became part of the tactical toolkit, used not just against bunkers, but against caves, spider holes, supply dumps, and any position where fire could do what bullets could not. The psychological impact was profound. Japanese soldiers who survived encounters with the Dragon rifle described it in terms that mixed fear and disbelief. They said the Americans had found a way to make rifles spit fire. They said the weapons burned without sound, that the flames came from nowhere, that there was no defense against them. Some units began retreating at the first sign of the fire, abandoning positions they had held for weeks, choosing flight over the certainty of burning alive. But the weapon was not without cost. The incendiary projectiles were dangerous to carry. If a Marine took a hit while carrying fuel-filled rounds, the result was catastrophic. 3 men died that way on Peleliu, killed not by enemy fire, but by their own weapons. The projectiles were also inconsistent. Some failed to ignite. Others exploded prematurely. A few veered off course and landed in friendly positions, causing burns and chaos. Reeves worked constantly to improve the design, but the fundamental problem remained. The weapon was a field modification, built with scrounged materials, tested under fire rather than in labs. It worked more often than it failed, and in combat that was good enough, but it was never perfect. The most detailed account of the Dragon rifle in action comes from the diary of Lieutenant Raymond Holt, platoon commander in the 5th Marines. Holt's platoon was tasked with clearing a cave complex on the northern end of Peleliu in late October. The caves were large, interconnected, and heavily defended. Previous assaults had failed. Casualties had been heavy. Holt knew that a frontal assault would be suicide, so he requested Dragon rifles and designed a new tactic. Instead of trying to enter the caves, his men would fire incendiary rounds into the entrances and let the fire do the work. The flames would consume the oxygen, fill the tunnels with smoke, and force the defenders to either surrender or die. It was brutal, it was effective, and it worked. Holt positioned 3 Dragon rifle shooters in a semicircle around the main cave entrance. At his signal, they fired simultaneously. The projectiles hit the opening and exploded into flames that rushed into the tunnel like a living thing. The fire spread fast, fed by the confined space and the oxygen inside. Within minutes, smoke was pouring out of multiple cave openings across the hillside. Japanese soldiers stumbled out, choking, burned, disoriented. Some surrendered. Others were shot as they emerged. A few stayed inside and suffocated. Holt wrote in his diary that the entire engagement lasted less than 20 minutes. He wrote that the Dragon rifles had accomplished what days of conventional assault could not. He also wrote that the screams from inside the cave haunted him, that the smell of burning flesh stayed in his nose for weeks, that he understood the weapon was necessary, but that necessity did not make it easier to live with. The moral weight of the weapon was not lost on the men who used it. Fire is a primal fear. It kills slowly. It causes agony. And unlike a bullet or a shell, which can be abstract and impersonal, fire is intimate. You see what it does. You hear what it does. The Marines who carried Dragon rifles knew they were using a weapon that caused suffering on a scale that went beyond the clinical violence of rifles and grenades. Some of them struggled with that knowledge. Others compartmentalized it, telling themselves that the enemy had chosen to fight from fortified positions, that the only way to break those positions was with fire, that the alternative was to send more Marines to die in frontal assaults. There was no good answer. There was only the reality of war, where survival often requires choices that cannot be justified in peacetime terms. By November, the Dragon rifle had evolved from a crude improvisation into a semi-standardized piece of equipment. Supply officers began scrounging materials specifically for the weapon. Armories set up makeshift production lines to build the projectiles in larger quantities. Training sessions taught new Marines how to load, aim, and fire the weapon safely. The design was refined to reduce misfires and improve accuracy. Some units experimented with variations, including larger projectiles that carried more fuel, smaller projectiles that could be fired from carbines, and delayed fuse versions that allowed the projectile to penetrate deeper into a target before igniting. None of these variations worked as well as the original, but the experimentation showed how quickly soldiers could adapt and innovate when given the freedom to do so. The Japanese response to the Dragon rifle was slower and less effective. Intelligence reports captured later in the war showed that Japanese commanders were aware of the weapon, but struggled to develop countermeasures. They tried increasing ventilation in bunkers, which made the fires less effective, but also made the positions more vulnerable to grenades and gas. They tried using water to extinguish the flames, but the fuel used in projectiles was designed to stick and burn through water suppression. They tried repositioning bunkers to increase the distance from likely firing positions, but that reduced their defensive effectiveness. In the end, the best response they could manage was to avoid fixed positions altogether, to shift toward mobile defense and ambush tactics that didn't rely on bunkers and caves. But that shift took time, and in the meantime, the Dragon rifle continued to break defensive lines that had held for weeks. The weapon saw limited use outside of Peleliu. A few units carried Dragon rifles to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, but by that point, the Marine Corps had begun issuing purpose-built incendiary devices and improved flamethrowers that offered similar capabilities with better safety and reliability. The field-modified Dragon rifles were quietly phased out, collected by supply officers, and either destroyed or stored in depots where they were eventually forgotten. No official records documented their development or use. No after-action reports analyzed their effectiveness. They existed in the gap between necessity and doctrine, in the space where soldiers solve problems that the system does not acknowledge or cannot address. Daniel Reeves survived Peleliu. He was wounded twice, once by shrapnel and once by a sniper round that shattered his collarbone, but he lived. He was evacuated to a hospital ship in November and spent the rest of the war recovering in a naval hospital in San Diego. He never received recognition for inventing the Dragon rifle. No medal was awarded. No commendation was filed. His name does not appear in histories of the battle or studies of weapons development. When he returned home to Montana after the war, he worked as a mechanic, raised a family, and rarely talked about what he had done. His son found a photograph of him holding a modified M1 Garand after he died in 1998, and when he asked other veterans what the weapon was, none of them knew. The knowledge had died with the men who used it. But the legacy of the Dragon rifle is not in official recognition or historical documentation. It is in the lives saved by a weapon that should not have existed, in the positions taken that should have been impossible, in the men who came home because someone refused to accept that the weapons they had were the only weapons they could have. It is in the willingness to experiment, to take risks, to break rules when the rules are getting people killed. And it is in the understanding that war is not fought according to manuals or doctrine, but according to the needs of the moment and the creativity of the people who have to live and die by those needs. The lesson of the Dragon rifle is the same lesson that appears again and again throughout military history. Soldiers innovate. They adapt. They take the tools they are given, and they change those tools when the tools are not enough. They do not wait for permission. They do not follow procedures. They act, because action is the only response to the immediacy of violence and death. The Dragon rifle was not a sophisticated weapon. It was not elegant or safe or officially sanctioned. But it worked, and in war, working is all that matters. The men who carried the Dragon rifle knew what they were doing. They knew the weapon was brutal. They knew it caused suffering. They knew that every time they fired it, they were choosing to burn human beings alive. But they also knew that the alternative was to watch their friends die trying to take positions that could not be taken with rifles and grenades alone. They made a choice. It was not a good choice. There are no good choices in war. But it was a choice that saved lives, that broke defensive lines, that turned impossible assaults into victories. And for the men who survived because of it, the weapon was not a moral question. It was the reason they made it home. The Japanese soldiers who faced the Dragon rifle understood it differently. To them, it was not a tool or a tactic. It was a symbol of American technological superiority, of the willingness to use any method to win, of the fear that comes from facing an enemy who can kill you from a distance without exposing himself to risk. The name they gave it, Dragon rifle, reflected that fear. Dragons in Japanese folklore are creatures of immense power, neither wholly good nor wholly evil, beings that exist beyond human understanding and cannot be fought with conventional means. The Marines who carried the weapon were not dragons. They were just men trying to survive. But in the smoke and fire of Peleliu, to the soldiers on the other side of the flames, the distinction did not matter. By the time the war ended, the Dragon rifle had been forgotten. The few that remained in supply depots were destroyed or lost. The men who built them returned to civilian life and rarely spoke of what they had done. The weapon was too crude, too dangerous, too morally complicated to be remembered with pride. But it existed. It worked. And for a few brutal weeks on an island that should never have been fought over, it changed the nature of combat. It proved that innovation does not require factories or laboratories or approval from above. It requires only necessity, creativity, and the willingness to try something new when everything else has failed. The story of the Dragon rifle is not a story of heroism or glory. It is a story of desperation and adaptation. It is a story of men who refused to accept that the tactics that were killing them were the only tactics available. It is a story of soldiers who saw a problem and solved it, not because they were ordered to, but because they had no other choice. And it is a reminder that war is not won by the side with the best weapons or the most resources. It is won by the side that adapts fastest, that innovates under pressure, that finds ways to survive when survival seems impossible. Daniel Reeves built a weapon that killed hundreds of men. He did it to save the lives of the men beside him. He did it because the weapons he had were not enough. He did it because necessity is the mother of invention, and in war, necessity is the only law that matters. He was never thanked. He was never honored. But his invention lived on in the memories of the men who used it and the fear of the men who faced it. And that, in the end, is the only recognition that matters in war. Not medals or commendations, but survival. Not glory, but coming home. The Dragon rifle was a weapon of fire and desperation, born in the mud of Peleliu and forgotten by history. But for the Marines who carried it and the Japanese soldiers who faced it, it was unforgettable. It was a weapon that should not have existed, used by men who should not have survived, in a battle that should never have been fought. And it worked. That is its legacy, not in museums or textbooks, but in the lives saved and the positions taken, and the knowledge that when everything else fails, human beings will find a way to keep fighting. The Dragon rifle was that way. And for a brief, brutal moment in the fall of 1944, it was the difference between victory and death. The effectiveness of the Dragon rifle went beyond simple tactical advantage. It represented a shift in how infantry combat could be waged in the Pacific Theater, where terrain and enemy tactics created challenges that conventional weapons struggled to address. The caves and bunkers of Peleliu were not unique. Similar fortifications existed on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and dozens of smaller islands that formed the defensive perimeter Japan had spent years constructing. The Japanese defensive doctrine in 1944 had evolved from the banzai charges of earlier battles into a strategy of attrition through fortification. They built positions designed to survive bombardment, to absorb casualties, and to inflict maximum damage on attacking forces. The strategy was brutally effective. American casualties in the Pacific were climbing even as victory became inevitable. Every island cost more lives than the last. Every assault revealed new defensive innovations that standard tactics could not overcome quickly or cheaply. The Dragon rifle offered a solution, but it was a solution the military establishment was slow to recognize. Part of the problem was institutional. The Marine Corps, like all military organizations, operated on doctrine and standardization. Weapons were tested, approved, and issued through channels that ensured safety, reliability, and consistency. Field modifications violated that process. They introduced variables that could not be controlled. They created liability issues. They undermined the chain of command by allowing individual soldiers to make decisions about equipment that were supposed to be made by experts. From the perspective of headquarters, the Dragon rifle was a problem even if it worked. It was unauthorized, dangerous, and difficult to replicate. The fact that it saved lives was secondary to the fact that it existed outside the system. But the men in the field did not care about the system. They cared about survival. And survival meant using whatever worked. Sergeant Kovac, who had authorized the first use of the Dragon rifle in his platoon, understood this instinctively. He had been in combat long enough to know that doctrine was written by men who were safe, and that survival was earned by men who were not. When a captain from regimental headquarters visited his position in late October and asked about the modified weapons his men were carrying, Kovac told him the truth. He said the weapons were field modifications, that they had not been approved, and that they had saved the lives of at least a dozen Marines in the past 3 weeks. The captain told him to stop using them. Kovacs said he would consider the order. He did not stop. Neither did the other squad leaders who had adopted the weapon. They understood that orders from the rear carried less weight than results at the front, and the results spoke for themselves. The incident revealed a tension that exists in every military organization, a conflict between control and effectiveness, between standardization and adaptation. The officers who wanted to ban the Dragon rifle were not wrong to worry about safety and consistency. Field modifications could and did fail. Soldiers were injured. Equipment malfunctioned. The lack of standardization made it difficult to train replacements or coordinate tactics across units. But the officers who defended the weapon were also not wrong. It worked. It broke defensive positions. It reduced casualties. And in the calculus of combat, effectiveness matters more than compliance. The debate never reached a formal conclusion. The war moved on. The weapon faded from use. But the underlying question remained. Who decides what weapons soldiers can use? The men who issue orders or the men who face fire? The psychological dimension of the Dragon rifle extended beyond the fear it created in the enemy. It also changed the way the Marines who used it thought about combat. Fire is a weapon of finality. When you shoot a rifle, the bullet either hits or misses, and the result is immediate. When you throw a grenade, it explodes and the result is immediate. But when you launch an incendiary projectile, the fire spreads. It consumes. It continues to kill long after the trigger is pulled. The Marines who used the Dragon rifle had to watch what their weapon did. They had to see the flame spread across bunkers, hear the screams from inside, smell the burning flesh in hair and cloth. Some of them became numb to it. Others carried the weight of it for the rest of their lives. Private First Class Anthony DeLuca, who carried a Dragon rifle during the final weeks of the Peleliu campaign, wrote letters home that were later donated to a military archive by his family. In one letter, written in early November, he described using the weapon against a cave position. He wrote that the flames had gone into the cave and that he had heard screaming for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. He wrote that he kept telling himself the men inside were the enemy, that they would have killed him if given a chance, that what he was doing was necessary. But he also wrote that he could not stop hearing the screams, that they followed him into sleep, that he wondered if God would forgive him for what he had done. The letter ended with a question. Does it matter if we win if we lose ourselves in the winning? DeLuca survived the war, but died in a car accident in 1953. His letter suggests a man struggling with the moral cost of survival, a struggle that was common among soldiers who used weapons designed to inflict maximum suffering. The technical evolution of the Dragon rifle also reflected the broader patterns of innovation in wartime. The first versions were crude, built with whatever materials were available, tested through trial and error. But as the weapon spread, soldiers with different skills contributed improvements. Machinists refined projectile casings to reduce weight and improve aerodynamics. Ordnance specialists experimented with different fuel mixtures to increase burn time and adhesion. Engineers redesigned the fuses to improve reliability. The weapon that emerged after several weeks of iterative development was markedly better than the original, though still far from what a formal research and development process could have produced. The improvements were not documented in reports or manuals. They were passed along through demonstration and word of mouth, part of the informal knowledge networks that connect soldiers in combat. One of the most significant technical improvements came from Corporal James Fenton, a Marine with a background in chemistry who had worked in a refinery before the war. Fenton noticed that the fuel mixture used in the early Dragon rifle projectiles burned too quickly. The flames were intense but brief, which reduced their effectiveness against deep bunkers or cave systems. He experimented with adding a thickening agent to the fuel, similar to what was used in napalm, to make it stick to surfaces and burn longer. The modification required access to materials that were not normally available to infantry, but Fenton had connections with supply personnel and managed to acquire small quantities of the thickening compound. The improved fuel burned for 30 to 40 seconds instead of 10 to 15, which made the weapon far more effective. Fenton's modification was adopted by other units. though he received no official recognition, and his contribution was never formally recorded. The strategic implications of the Dragon rifle were limited by its scope. The weapon was never used in large numbers. It never changed the outcome of a major battle. It did not alter the trajectory of the war, but it had a cumulative effect that mattered. Every bunker cleared with fewer casualties, every cave position broken without a costly assault, every Marine who survived because the weapon gave him a tactical advantage. All of these small impacts added up. The Dragon rifle saved lives. Exactly how many is impossible to calculate, but the men who used it believed the number was significant. And in war, where every life matters to the people who depend on it, significant is enough. The weapon also influenced post-war thinking about infantry tactics and equipment. After the war, the Marine Corps conducted studies on the lessons learned from the Pacific Campaign. One of the findings was that standard infantry weapons were inadequate for dealing with fortified positions, and that flamethrowers, while effective, were too dangerous and short-range to be the primary solution. The studies recommended developing rifle-launched incendiary devices that could combine the range of a rifle with the destructive power of fire. Those recommendations eventually led to the development of weapons like the M202 Flash, a four-barreled incendiary rocket launcher introduced in the 1960s. The M202 was a direct descendant of the ideas behind the Dragon rifle, though the connection was never explicitly made in official documentation. The men who invented and used the Dragon rifle did not think of themselves as innovators or pioneers. They thought of themselves as soldiers trying to survive. They did not set out to create a new weapon or to influence military doctrine. They set out to solve a problem that was getting their friends killed. The fact that their solution worked, that it spread to other units, that it influenced future weapons development, all of that was secondary. What mattered to them was the mission they were given and the men beside them. The weapon was just a tool, a means to an end. But it was also proof that soldiers, when given the freedom and necessity to adapt, can accomplish things that formal systems cannot. The story of the Dragon rifle is ultimately a story about the nature of innovation in extreme conditions. Innovation is often portrayed as a process that happens in laboratories and research facilities, driven by experts with resources and time. But some of the most important innovations in history have happened in the field, under fire, by people with neither expertise nor resources, but who had necessity and creativity. The Dragon rifle was not designed by engineers. It was not tested by scientists. It was not approved by committees. It was built by a corporal from Montana who saw a problem and refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable. And it worked because the men who used it understood what they needed better than anyone sitting in an office hundreds of miles away. Daniel Reeves never sought credit for what he created. He never wrote a memoir or gave interviews. He did not consider himself a hero. When asked about the war, he would say that he did what he had to do and that he was lucky to come home. But the men who fought beside him remembered. They remembered the weapon he built, the lives it saved, the fear it created in the enemy. And they remembered that when the situation was impossible and the tools were inadequate, someone found a way to change the situation and improve the tools. That memory, passed along through reunions and stories and informal oral history of veterans, is the true legacy of the Dragon rifle, not in official records or museums, but in the knowledge that innovation is possible even in the worst circumstances, and that survival often depends on the willingness to try something new when everything else has failed. The Dragon rifle was fire and desperation made into a weapon. It was brutal, dangerous, and morally complicated. It was also effective, necessary, and life-saving. It existed for a brief moment in the chaos of Peleliu, then disappeared, forgotten by history, but remembered by the men who needed it. And that is enough, because in war, the weapons that matter are not the ones that look best or that follow the rules. They're the ones that work when it matters most. The Dragon rifle worked, and for the Marines who carried it, that was all that mattered. If you enjoyed this story of forgotten innovation and battlefield ingenuity, subscribe for more deep dives into the untold history of war. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what other stories should we bring to light?